Chapter 22. Capture. Lockjaw was about to slice Silverspot's neck, causing a fatal blow when he felt a sudden grip on his neck. Silverspot had given up on fighting Lockjaw and was accepting her fate when she felt his heavy weight pulled off of her. She looked at Saberclaw and Razorwing, who were both nowhere near her, and was confused because Saberclaw wasn't using her telekinesis. In fact, Razorwing had come to his senses and was backing up in fear as Saberclaw stayed in shocked stillness. Silverspot looked up and saw Lockjaw violently clawing at the back of his neck as a large, black hand held him in the air. Silverspot gawked when she saw who had saved her. She followed the hand and saw Iron Stripe gritting his teeth. "Lockjaw, how dare you disobey Rebaya's orders?" he barked. He tossed Lockjaw to the side, and Lockjaw's body, which is smaller than Iron Stripe's large frame, landed with a thud, causing him to groan. Iron Stripe continued, "You were about to kill Silverspot when Rebay specifically commanded you to not engage," he yelled as Lockjaw hurriedly stood up and looked at Saberclaw for help. Saberclaw just shrugged and tilted her head as she examined Iron Stripe. He was large, and she was commanded by the ghost of Rebay, controlling her to not attack, but she really wanted to kill him. Iron Stripe leaned down to Silverspot's level and stretched out his hand to her. Her face twisted in rage as she slapped his hand away. She stood up on her own and snarled. "How could you?" She brandished her fists at him. He caught her punch and held her curled fingers in the air as he looked into her optics with sorrow. "Silver, you know I did it for your own good. Please forgive me," he begged as Silverspot yanked her hand away from him. Saberclaw was doing everything in her power to gain control of her body again, so she was in a sort of daze. However, Razorwing was laser-focused on revenge. He lunged at Iron Stripe with his fists raised. Then he realized that he didn't have to blindly attack Iron Stripe. He could just make Iron Stripe attack blindly. Razorwing turned invisible just before he got to Iron Stripe, causing the black-painted robot to turn in different directions abruptly as he looked for Razorwing. He scanned the thin forest for any kind of movement that would give away Razorwing's location. All he saw was the three humans standing, stunned, as they tried to figure out what to do. As they watched Iron Stripe and the other large robots, the humans were frozen with fear. Then, Sam finally snapped to attention and turned to his two family members. "It would probably be best if we hide now. You know, since the situation with the giant war machines could get out of hand at any given moment." Lila nodded enthusiastically, and John began walking toward a large group of bushes. As the three of them crouched down to hide in the bushes, John answered sarcastically, "No, I think hiding isn't a good idea." He joked as they watched the battle closely. Meanwhile, Iron Stripe was getting beaten by an invisible enemy. Every way he turned, an invisible metal limb would smack him. He could hear Razorwing's prideful laugh echo off the trees. "Come on, Iron Stripe. You're the big bad traitor, right?" he mocked. Silverspot, unsure of what to do, simply stood as she watched Iron Stripe struggle against his invisible opponent. Saberclaw's persistent fighting against Rebaya's control was making her mind sore. The pain in her head was gaining intensity, and she felt her body going numb. She put her hand on the side of her hand as she felt helplessness. The chaos surrounding her overwhelmed her. Iron Stripe was being violently overpowered, and Razorwing seemed to be losing his mind with how much he was enjoying Iron Stripe's humiliation. Also, Silverspot was looking right at her, expecting something that Saberclaw felt she couldn't give. She was struggling to control what little thoughts she could. Saberclaw felt firm hands grip her arm. She looked over and saw Lockjaw's worried expression. His fingers wrapped around her upper arm as his concern shined through the careful face forced onto him by Rebay. "Are you all right, Saberclaw?" he asked. She was forced to nod and looked away from him. She looked at Iron Stripe and called out to Razorwing because she assumed that he was near the black robot. "Show yourself, you coward!" she yelled as she forced her body to continue through the haze. Sure enough, Razorwing was no idiot and didn't show himself like he was commanded to. Saberclaw's facial expression hardened as she crouched, putting her hand on the ground to feel Razorwing's footsteps. She focused and noticed that there was a clear thumping in between herself and Iron Stripe. She quickly stood up and lunged in Iron Stripe's direction. Saberclaw crashed into an invisible body, and she pushed it over. She was on the ground on top of Razorwing when he finally revealed himself. He smiled at her. "Hey, Saber. Still controlled by Rebay?" he asked with strained sarcasm. Lockjaw's angry persona cracked a little as his jealousy showed. Saberclaw slapped him across the face and stood back up, making sure to hold Razorwing down with her boot. Iron Stripe calmed down and looked at Saberclaw as she stretched out her overturned hand. Now, Razorwing couldn't move and was pinned to the ground by Saberclaw's telekinesis. He struggled, but knew that it was no use. Silverspot, finally acting, tried to sneak up on Saberclaw. However, Lockjaw noticed this and tripped her, stomping on her head and knocking her unconscious. Saberclaw's head began to hurt again as she watched Lockjaw do this, because her actual mind was fighting Rebaya's control with everything she had. Razorwing yelled and struggled as Silverspot's head hit the ground. Iron Stripe turned his head away with guilt and sadness, but spoke with a heavy tone. "It is for the best, Silver." He spoke to Silverspot, but she couldn't hear him anymore. Saberclaw and Lockjaw, however, were emotionless since their thoughts and emotions were tightly locked away inside their heads. Lila was about to jump out of the human's hiding spot when John pulled her back to the ground and whispered, "Lila, there's nothing we can do." He spoke with a heavy heart, and Lila put her hands over her mouth as tears began to roll down her cheeks. Sam closed his eyes and turned his head away from the scene before them. Saberclaw stared at Silverspot's limp body and asked, "Well, what do we do now?" She turned to Iron Stripe. He sighed and answered, "I assume we should bring them to Rebay. I don't think I will ever find redemption from what I have done to Silverspot. It is probably better if I am loyal to Rebay at this point." He gently picked up Silverspot and held her in his arms, looking down at her peaceful face. Lockjaw crouched down and tilted his head with a mocking demeanor as Razorwing struggled. "What about Razorwing? Should I knock him out too, or can I have a little fun with him?" He smirked and grabbed Razorwing's neck tightly, his pure hatred towards the red robot reflecting through his eyes. Razorwing clenched his jaw and fought Saberclaw's telekinesis. Iron Stripe quickly turned around and spoke with a warning tone. "Absolutely not. Just knock him out so it isn't too mentally strenuous for Saberclaw." Lockjaw sighed heavily and shoved Razorwing's head back into the dirt. Saberclaw, wanting to hurry this up, crouched down and brushed her hand over the side of Razorwing's face. This calmed him just enough to distract him, and Saberclaw shoved her pointed fingers under a specific plate of metal near his right audio receptor. This caused him to lose consciousness immediately. Iron Stripe tilted his head in confusion when he saw this, and Lockjaw asked in amazement, "How did you do that?" He hoisted Razorwing over his shoulders. Saberclaw shrugged. "I'm not sure. I just knew where to put pressure." Iron Stripe turned around and began walking deeper into the woods. He felt deeply burdened because he felt guilty. He knew he had made a mistake by betraying the Sentiron, but he knew he had no choice. He also debated leaving Silverspot to escape, but Rebay would likely know because she could intercept every thought from the two robots following him closely. He also felt pity for Lockjaw and Saberclaw. He knew fully that Rebay's mind control was ruthless and a dishonorable way to defeat one's enemies. He hated that they had to go through something so traumatic at such a young age. Meanwhile, as the robots disappeared, Lila shot up out of the bushes. She jumped forward and looked around abruptly, noticing that the robots had left. She looked at the ground with wide eyes, panting, as the two men also walked out of the bushes. John shook his head. "Well, what do we do now?" he asked. Sam just stared at him, wondering how he could be so calm, and answered, "How am I supposed to know? The only ones who could do anything against Rebay have been taken," he exclaimed and gestured wildly. John raised an eyebrow and put his hands up in submission. Lila looked at her sneakers and commented, "So, if we have no one left, then we need to get someone back. The question is, how do we do that?" She questioned herself as she put her fingers on her chin. Once again, John shook his head violently with confusion. Sam's voice cracked as he put his hand on Lila's shoulder. "Lila, I doubt we will be able to do anything to get them back. You just need to calm down a little, and then you can think straight. Lila shook him off of her and wrinkled her nose in disgust. I am thinking straight. I'm not going to sit here and be helpless, she yelled. Sam stepped back a little because of Lila's tone. He knew it was disrespectful, but it reminded him so much of his wife, Lila's mother. Catherine had been told that Sam and Lila probably wouldn't come home most nights, so she probably wasn't worried currently. Lila had inherited majority of her traits from Catherine, so Sam liked the girl's annoyed features because they reminded him of his wife. Lila was confused by Sam's hesitation and asked, Well, Dad? She tilted her head. Sam sighed and said, I have an idea. How about we go to the military? Raphael should back us up, remember? And they're looking for Saberclaw anyway, so if we could find the army, then I am sure we can hitch a ride. He looked at John and Lila for a response. John smiled in approval as Lila nodded. I think that might be our best move for now. She smirked as she turned back to the area where the robots had been fighting. John also looked at the forest area and got an idea. Wait, that annoying general guy is tracking Saberclaw, right? He asked. Sam raised an eyebrow and answered, Yeah, do you have an idea? He asked. John rubbed his hands together. If the general is tracking Saberclaw and hasn't shown up here yet, then he should show up at any moment. He began walking toward the forest, and the other two followed him. Lila tilted her head and gestured with confusion. What do you mean? She asked. Sam finally understood and answered excitedly. He means that the army should be hot on Saberclaw's trail, and they should be following her. So, they will follow her tracks right to the last place she was, which is here. They will show up soon, hopefully. Lila gasped with recognition as they stood in the middle of the area where the robots had fought each other. Blue-green liquid decorated the grass, and Lila studied it carefully. She knew that this was the battle site of what could be considered an internecine fight. This brought her sorrow because she knew that Saberclaw didn't have control over herself when she hurt Silverspot and Razorwing. Lockjaw and Ironstripe, however, had uncertain motives. She knew that Lockjaw was under mind control as well, so he might not have done the things he did if he had control over his body. Lila couldn't know for sure. When her thoughts landed on Ironstripe, she was almost certain that he was against the Sentiron. He had openly declared that he was switching sides reluctantly, even though he seemed to be hesitant when confronted by his partner, Silverspot. Lila, who was thinking about these things and looking at the blue-green colored liquid, stood back up when she heard her father cautiously call her name. When she looked at him, Sam was glancing around at the thin woods. She also copied his actions and saw the many human soldiers surrounding them with large weapons. Apparently, the general didn't disappoint. The army had shown up just as John had predicted. Each human was sturdily encased in strong armor and helmets that covered their faces. They stood proudly with their blasters over their torsos as they seemed to stare at the three civilians surrounded by scattered G that glowed brightly. An older man in heavy armor, but no helmet, stepped forward. He had gray, thin hair and a stern facial expression that seemed to relax in an annoyed way when he recognized the three human civilians. This man was undoubtedly the general, and he called with smugness, Well, we meet again. It seems I can't get rid of you three. He smirked as Lila wrinkled her nose. Sam put his arm protectively over his daughter and answered with sarcasm. Yeah, you just can't shake us, can you? Anyway, we need your help. General Kane sighed heavily as the army seemed to relax. General Kane scoffed, then spoke to them with a smug and superior tone. Civilians always need something. What do you want now? He insulted them. John was about to say something rash in return, but got an intense side-eye from his brother that told him that probably wasn't a very good idea. However, Lila wasn't backing down. We want to track down and free the Sentiron. You know the robots you want to lock up so badly? Well, we seem to have found Saberclaw before you could, and she nearly killed us all. She, a blue robot, and a black robot took Razorwing and Silverspot to their base, or whatever, so we need to free them somehow. As you can probably see, this is where you and your army come in. You give us the power to rescue our war machine friends. She spoke with a commanding tone that the sergeant didn't like at all. Sam quickly turned his head to her to scold her, but he simply looked at her in disbelief and then looked back at the general. General Kane looked like his eyes were about to pop out of his head. "You act like you already know that I will risk my men's lives for a child's scheme. You are what, 10? You aren't fit to have anything to do with my army, child." He spoke down to her like she was some animal. Sam severely didn't approve of this and pointed an accusing finger at the general. "How dare you dash?" He was interrupted by Lila grabbing his arm and shaking her head in denial. Sam stepped back, but glared and pressed his lips together with compressed anger. Lila spoke instead with a deadly calm tone. "Sir, don't underestimate me. I may seem helpless on my own, but I am sure that once I free Saberclaw, she will not hesitate to teach you a lesson if you continue your rude words to me. Besides, you don't know anything about who you are tracking, and the three of us have vital information about your target's fighting techniques, or even their physical features and attributes. Are you sure you want to turn down our offer?" she asked with seriousness. John looked at Lila's determined face with pride. He was very pleased that she had such strategic abilities. The general glanced around with uncertainty as he thought about the current situation. He understood that the civilians actually had some value, but his ego didn't let him believe that he needed them for this mission. Finally, he gave them his answer. "Fine, you all will march with us and direct me on where this army needs to go to find these robots. You'll also tell me how to defeat these robots. If you don't, there will be consequences, got it?" he asked. Lila nodded excitedly and pointed to her right, saying, "They went that way, and there should be a trail of bluish-green liquid that leaked from their wounds." She walked closer to the sergeant and waited for him to lead his army. The other two civilians followed her, and the sergeant waved for the soldiers to follow him. Sergeant Kane turned to his left and began walking with the crunching of hundreds of footsteps behind him. Meanwhile, the robots had made it back onto Rebae's ship. The mind control holding Saberclaw's conscience hostage was not as strong as before, and she was managing to regain little bits of herself slowly. However, she tried not to show signs of this so that no one would notice, especially Rebae. The Queen had welcomed them and threw Silverspot and Razorwing into the same cages as the thousands of otherworldly beings. Saberclaw and Lockjaw were forced to bow in front of Rebae, but it seemed easier for him. Ironstripe must have been just going through the motions because when Rebae told him to stand back up, he did so with no expression. Rebae was sitting on her throne and smiling with pride, thinking that she finally had a clear path to victory over Earth. Lockjaw seemed completely focused on Rebae and didn't even look at Saberclaw. The green robot looked out the large window and saw that they were no longer in space, but the warship was levitating just above the ground deep inside a large patch of trees. She thought this was odd because she didn't originally think that Rebae had the power to get through the force field with her large warship, but apparently she could. About 30 Nextari scientists and technicians worked diligently in front of some sorts of alien consoles around the large room. These Nextari weren't as arrogant and bulky as the soldiers that Saberclaw had past experiences with, but they were definitely just as sure about Earth's fate as their queen was. Boltar stood beside Rebae's throne, and his black eyes observed her face as she spoke. The excited queen praised the three robots before her. "It was a bumpy road here, but you three managed to redeem yourselves and please me. However, Ironstripe, I have found that Silverspot is too much of a threat to let free." She lowered her head and cunningly waited for his reaction. Sure enough, the robot stood up violently, and his face showed his panic as he yelled, "What? You promised you would let her go." He was grabbed by two soldiers who had been standing behind him. Ironstripe began struggling against them, but stopped when Rebae spoke again. "Well, I could rethink my decision concerning your partner if you remain by my side, Ironstripe." She smirked, knowing that she was using him and his concern for Silverspot. He clenched his jaw and bore his metal teeth as he continued with his loud tone. "I am not that idiotic, Rebae. How do I know you are not tricking me?" He angrily waited for her answer, but he knew exactly what it was. She cocked her head to the side a little with a sly smile. "You don't. That's the fun part. Although, I will assure you she will be dead by the end of this Earth Day if you don't obey me." She spoke joyfully, but her words dripped with deceit. Instantly, Ironstripe froze and dropped to his knees as the soldiers backed away from him. knowing they no longer had to hold him still. Rebay sighed. So predictable. As for you two, you will be the highest ranks in my military for your loyalty. She smiled as Iron Stripe watched the two robots. Rebay's control must have glitched or something, because Lockjaw's head snapped to the side, then went back to its original position. Boltar looked at Rebay with concern mixed with fear as she gripped her head in pain. She sneered, "You know what? Forget what I said earlier. Lockjaw has gotten on my last nerve." She turned to Boltar with an extremely annoyed expression and commanded, "Boltar, I will stop controlling him, and you can do whatever you want with him. Dissect him for all I care." She closed her strange eyes and focused on Lockjaw's mind. Lockjaw dropped to his knees, his head pounding with pain. Soon, the pain subsided and he felt dizzy and extremely tired. It felt like all of his energy had left him, as well as Rebay's control. The two soldiers grabbed his weak body by the arms and dragged him behind them as they followed Boltar. The next Hari scientist walked out of the room with excitement because he had wanted to study this unusual species since he first heard of their existence. Saberclaw saw this and felt a very strong feeling of resistance. She strongly didn't want anything bad to happen to Lockjaw, so she used all of her mental strength to fight Rebay's control. Saberclaw fell to the floor, clutching her head in pain and crying out. "Get out of my head," she screamed. This was her first action without Rebay guiding her. Rebay also shook her head and whimpered as she fought for control over Saberclaw's body. However, Saberclaw's need to be free overpowered Rebay's desire for control, and Saberclaw felt Rebay's angry thoughts disappear and her own thoughts become clearer. Iron Stripe stared at Saberclaw with shock as she placed her feet beneath her. The green robot slowly stood up and looked at Rebay with pure green eyes. However, she soon fell backwards and nearly collapsed because her head felt so heavy and her body felt unusual. Rebay looked up, still holding her head up, and glared at Saberclaw with intense fury. Rebay pointed a shaking finger at Saberclaw and commanded, "Put her with the others, and don't forget that she can't be left unattended. I will deal with her myself later." She spoke with a low, menacing tone. Iron Stripe watched as two more soldiers rushed into the room and dragged the weakened Saberclaw out. Saberclaw felt the six-fingered hands clutch her arms and wings, pulling her violently through the hallways. Her vision was blurry, so she barely realized the many cages around her. Suddenly, she heard the creaking of bars moving and was shoved into one of the cages. She hit the floor hard and felt her entire body jerk as she tried to reposition herself to see her surroundings better. Her vision had cleared a little now, so she saw the two soldiers close the bars and strut away. Her left wing flopped to her side as she took in everything around her. She was happy she could control her own body and thoughts now, but she didn't have much strength and was now confined in a large cage. She moved her head from side to side slowly and noticed that she wasn't alone. A good number of creatures from other planets were hunched against the walls, terrified and desperately trying to avoid her. She even noticed that there were young ones on her side of the bars, too. She wasn't sure if they were in fact children, but they looked immature and were significantly smaller than the creatures they were clinging to. Saberclaw looked in front of her and saw the cage across from her. Inside, there was more creatures, but she also saw Silverspot and Razorwing laying on the floor unconscious. She wanted to rescue them, but that was the least of her concerns as of right now. She managed just enough strength to sit up. She looked at the strong bars, keeping her in the cage. She figured she could probably rip them apart with her telekinesis, but found that she didn't have enough mental ability to move anything with her mind. She grunted with frustration as she struggled to stand. "Arg, I can't do anything anymore," she whispered angrily to herself. Saberclaw threw herself against the wall behind her and slowly sunk to the floor with sorrow. She could hardly remember anything during Rebay's control over her, and she wasn't sure if her human friend were all right. Now that she had calmed down a little, she realized that the other creatures in the cage were making sounds. Some of them seemed to be speaking in alien languages, but some of them were just whimpering. Saberclaw let her head drop to the side, and she saw one creature step forward. It had 4 arms and an unusual body shape. It spoke to her with a fearful tone, but seemed determined. "Who you are? You desire kill?" it said in broken English. Saberclaw immediately perked up because this foreign being was speaking one of the Earth languages, and she could understand it. She spoke rapidly in response. "What? You can speak English. How?" She stared at the creature with wide eyes as it processed her words. The thing's facial expression changed to stress confusion as it gestured wildly. "I not understand." Slower. It waited for her response, and she thought for a few seconds. It seemed to speak English, but barely. She slowed down and repeated herself more clearly. "I am Saberclaw, and I do not desire to kill you. I only desire to defeat the crazy Nextari Queen." She tried to use words that she knew the alien would understand so that it would comprehend her speech. After a few seconds of what had to have been careful thoughts, the alien responded, "Greetings, Saberclaw. I also want death of Rebay. You are powerful enough. Tell I if you're only of your kind in your story, but quickly. I will tell I's story after." Its English was very incorrect, but Saberclaw was just happy to be able to communicate with an ally. The green robot moved into a more comfortable position and spoke slowly about her past experiences and how she arrived in the cage. The alien listened closely, occasionally asking her to slow down or repeat herself. After Saberclaw finished, the alien explained its origin. "I am from another planet. I learned English from soldiers walking up and down halls, but not much. Me and my people were captured, so we are here. I not, but friends are afraid of you." It gestured towards other creatures that looked like it and were pressed up against the wall with fear. Saberclaw's eyes fell on them, and they began shaking nervously. The alien that was talking with Saberclaw spoke in its native language to them, and they relaxed a little, but they still weren't very trusting. Saberclaw tilted her head and said, "Your English is surprisingly good, but can definitely be improved. What exactly did you tell your friends? Because I promise I won't harm them." Over the past hour or so in the cage, Saberclaw had learned more about this alien. She learned that the species didn't have names, but was classified by certain bodily features. Thus, she didn't call it by any name. Also, its species was very intelligent and were fast learners. Just from a few words spoken by Nextari soldiers, and even Saberclaw's recent comments, this alien had learned a phenomenal amount of English. She concluded, since this species was much smaller than a Nextari, they were only defeated because of physical combat abilities. She felt pity for them, but she didn't let it show because she was in the same situation. Saberclaw actually noticed just how much time had passed. It had been 5 or 6 hours. Silverspot and Razorwing had woken up, but they seemed to be struggling to regain their senses, so they hadn't noticed anything yet. Saberclaw waited for Alien to respond, and it was about to, but was interrupted by the creaking of the opening bars. All heads turned toward the entrance of the cage as 2 soldiers threw someone in. Saberclaw recognized him and screamed, "Lockjaw!" She rushed up to him as his body hit the floor with a clanking sound. He gasped from the impact and tried to sit up, but fell back to the floor. He coughed, and G flew out of his mouth. Saberclaw's hands hovered over his body as she tried to sort out her panicked thoughts and figure out how to help him. He had cuts all over his body and a large gash on his side, which he covered with his hand. His hands were covered in blue-green liquid, and he groaned as he let his head fall to the side. A pool of G was forming around him as he tried to move, but failed. Saberclaw's voice cracked, and she trembled as she placed her hands on Lockjaw's scarred chest. "Lockjaw, what happened? How can I help you?" she yelled as he looked up at her with weak, bright blue eyes that flickered and glowed. He sighed and struggled to speak. "Experiments of some kind. I don't think there's much you can do, Saber." Lockjaw's chest raised a little as he tried to stand up, but an alien hand pushed him to the floor again. The creature, whom Saberclaw had become acquainted with, was now looming over Lockjaw as well. Saberclaw looked up at it with worried eyes as it spoke to her. "I see this evil one is important to you, so I will help. You need something to stop the liquid from flowing out of him. If you don't, he will die." It tore a piece of its clothing off and wrapped it around Lockjaw's chest. The rapid flowing of G slowed and eventually stopped, but Lockjaw was still in immense pain. He groaned as the creature continued talking to Saberclaw. "You must calm yourself, Saberclaw. Brace him against the wall. It will help him more than if he is on the ground." Saberclaw obeyed, and Lockjaw struggled to position himself comfortably, but he managed. Lockjaw let his head fall against the wall, and he cried out in agony. His torso was almost completely covered in G, and his appendages were slashed deeply. He also had a large cut from his right eye that ran almost to the top of his head that leaked quickly. Saberclaw gently wiped the blue-green liquid off of his face as she tried to keep her hand from shaking. She spoke in a gentle voice as she maneuvered closer to him. "Lockjaw, what happened to you?" she asked. He gasped through his teeth as he tried to act like he wasn't in intense pain. "She told Boltar that he could dissect me, and he didn't entirely do that, but it sure does feel like it. He did this to me over the past. I don't know how long it's been." He paused as he tried to count how long it had been. Saberclaw stared at him. She knew that he had been in such a terrible session for more than 5 hours. She covered her mouth, but wasn't entirely sure if it was to hide her face or keep her from saying something she would regret. The creature on the opposite side of Lockjaw was also shocked at his determination and strength. Across the hallway, Silverspot and Razorwing had fully awakened and looked to their side. They saw Lockjaw braced up against a wall and Saberclaw by his side, and they had mixed reactions. Razorwing had many questions, so he didn't show much emotion other than confusion. However, Silverspot grabbed the bars and yelled, "Take out the dart!" She slammed herself on the bars to get Saberclaw's attention. Saberclaw had a split second of happiness at the sight of Silverspot and Razorwing awake, but soon snapped back to reality. She looked down to where Silverspot was pointing and saw a dart sticking out of Lockjaw's leg. It was halfway full and seemed to be currently injecting a liquid into Lockjaw. Saberclaw quickly ripped the dart out and Lockjaw flinched, but it didn't seem to cause him a massive amount of pain. In fact, he sighed with relief and grabbed Saberclaw's hand, mouthing his thankfulness. Saberclaw looked back up at Silverspot and saw the silver robot's now relieved face. Silverspot loudly called. It was Poison Saber. "I see you have defeated Rebay in your mind?" she asked from across the hall. Saberclaw nodded, then refocused herself on Lockjaw. She squeezed his hand as she held eye contact with him. He smiled weakly and whispered, "So now you like me." He joked, and Saberclaw laughed, but not because she thought he was funny. She was just so happy that he felt well enough to joke around, so she laughed. She smiled widely in return. "Lockjaw, be quiet. You need to save your strength." She shushed him, and he responded, "Yes, ma'am." Saberclaw shook her head, but continued smiling.